We're about to take you down into the dark, dangerous depths of Eagle's Nest, one of the most hauntingly beautiful but treacherous caves on the planet. On October 15, 2016, two highly experienced cave divers ventured into this underwater labyrinth, but never made it back out alive. What lured these men to risk everything by pushing the limits over 300 feet below the surface? What nightmarish scenario unfolded that turned their dive into a waking nightmare? What critical lessons can we learn from this tragedy to prevent future dive disasters? Our story begins with Patrick Peacock and Chris Rittenmeyer. These were no ordinary weekend warriors when it came to cave diving. Patrick and Chris were among the most highly trained and experienced divers in the game. With decades of experience navigating treacherous underwater environments, they had racked up thousands of dives between them. From the ice-cold alpine lakes of Europe to the twisting lava tubes of Mexico, there were few cave systems these adrenaline junkies hadn't conquered. They knew their gear inside and out, how to plan dives with ambitious depths and distances, how to handle any equipment failures, and how to stay calm under extreme pressure. At least, that's what their impressive credentials suggested. So, what brought these young cave explorers to the famous Eagle's Nest system on October 15th? For Patrick and Chris, it represented the ultimate test of their skills, an opportunity to push their limits further than ever before. At over 300 feet deep and riddled with restrictive tunnels, Eagle's Nest was the Everest of cave dives, and they were determined to summit the peak. Little did they know, this formidable challenge was about to present them with the most extreme conditions they had ever faced. Paradise conceals a death trap. From the surface, Eagle's Nest seems like a diver's dream. This picturesque sinkhole sits nestled in the lush woodlands of Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area in Florida. Its bright blue waters appear to offer the perfect entry point to a refreshing underground playground, but looks can be deceiving. You see, Eagle's Nest may seem like a serene swimming hole, but it's actually the vertical entry corridor to an underground hellscape, a twisting, silty maze that has claimed the lives of over 10 experienced divers since the 1980s. Below that inviting pool, a limestone tunnel descends vertically for 70 feet before opening into a cavern the size of an airplane hangar. Dangerous paths and dark side passages spread out everywhere, making a deadly maze where it's easy to get lost forever. The biggest hazard in Eagle's Nest? That would be the restrictions. Those pinch points and silty tunnels that make simply squeezing your body through feel like getting birthed through the eye of a needle. If a diver makes a small mistake while moving through these narrow passages, their air could be cut off completely, their vision obscured by swirling sand, or their equipment gets stuck in the rocks. And for Patrick and Chris, these narrow passages would be a tougher challenge than they expected. The descent. So with all the risks, why did these two experienced divers decide Eagle's Nest was worth gambling their lives over? Well, like any extreme athlete, the lure of pushing their limits to go where few humans have gone before was simply irresistible. That thirst for thrills and discoveries is what drove Patrick and Chris to spend October 14th prepping Eagle's Nest for their ambitious dive. They staged over a dozen cylinders of bailout gas and marker lines at key points throughout the system in case of emergencies. With all their gear and decompression supplies ready, the two felt ready to tackle the big challenge on October 15th. At 2 p.m., a third diver, acting as surface support, watched as Patrick and Chris made their descent. Their less experienced friend, Justin Blakely, explored an area closer to the surface and was on the lookout. For the first 30 to 40 minutes, it was smooth sailing as they utilized their diver propulsion vehicles to glide through vertical shafts, bedding planes, and tight tunnels. Their destination? Revelation Space, widely considered the Everest of Eagle's Nest at 260 feet. According to data later recovered from their dive computers, Patrick and Chris reached their turnaround point at around 43 minutes into the dive. But the real nightmare was only just beginning during their return trip. The restriction. At around 49 minutes into the dive, they encountered their first major obstacle, one of those dreaded restrictions they'd have to wiggle their way through, known ominously as the pit. This was the first of two nasty bottlenecks barring their path back to the entrance. Imagine having to remove your heavy equipment, breathe out completely to flatten your stomach, then twist sideways like a bendy toy to squeeze through a gap barely wider than a small drum. That's the type of nightmarish hurdle Patrick and Chris were now facing. Their dive computers show the pair spent around 3 minutes just trying to clear the initial pit restriction before aborting and heading back for another try. For reasons unknown, they spent another 3 minutes struggling at minute 58, before apparently giving up on getting through together. Maybe one diver's gear was preventing the other from making it, or maybe the silty conditions had turned the tunnel into an opaque, breath-stealing death trap where staying put was no longer an option. Whatever the case, this is where Patrick and Chris reached a fateful crossroads. One path led back to the open waters they'd descended from, while the other path forward was about to turn into a journey through the last circle of an underground hell. Battling for their lives. The clock was ticking, and air consumption rates were rising rapidly as the duo's struggles continued beyond the pit restriction. The lifeline was so close, yet cut off by that underwater roadblock. Then, at around 61 minutes into what should have been just an average day's dive, one diver's dive computer shows a catastrophic mishap. Perhaps the rebreather springing a leak or being damaged while contorting through the pit passage. From this point on, Patrick and Chris were forced to abandon their tried-and-true rebreather system and fully ditch one diver's gear entirely just to have a shot at reaching their bailout regulators waiting nearby. Can you imagine the panic, the confusion, the sheer sense of dread these two must have felt at this moment? In the blink of an eye, their highly choreographed dive plan was destroyed, draining their gas supplies and options with every passing second. Yet, they stuck together, unwilling to leave a man behind. The dive computer data shows they continued together, attempting to navigate through this life-threatening situation where it's either survive or perish. Just 100 feet from the surface, Patrick and Chris found a backup tank of fresh air, but it was frustratingly placed out of reach on the wrong side of the pit's exit. They were so close, yet tragically so far from safety. The bitter end. What played out next can only be theorized based on the positioning of their bodies, equipment, and gas levels. But it appears Patrick and Chris made one final desperate attempt to push through the pit one last time in search of that exit. Maybe they thought they could squeeze through, ditch any remaining gear on the other side to shed weight, then rocket up on what little gas reserves they had left. Or maybe, disoriented by the swirling silt and running on fumes, they accidentally took the wrong direction, thinking it led to the way out to fresh air. Whatever happened in those final frantic moments, the aftermath was a scene of total chaos and carnage. When recovery divers entered hours later, they found Patrick hanging motionless in the water. His rebreather was still strapped on, but his bailout cylinders were missing and his mouthpiece was knocked out of place. A deployed safety spool trailed off into the distance. Perhaps a desperate attempt to find his way back when visibility was zero. Just ahead, the body of Chris floated lifelessly, stripped of all gear except his dry suit. His buoyant exposure suit had inflated uncontrollably, likely when he ran out of his breathing gas and tried to kick for the surface. The two friends were only a few feet apart, but a series of bad decisions and lack of preparation due to overconfidence led to their eternal separation. Surrounding them was a debris field of tanks, lights, and other gear, all the tools they had carefully staged to try and prevent exactly this type of underwater catastrophe. The sight was nothing short of heart-wrenching for the recovery team. In that final struggle, it seemed Patrick and Chris had tried every last-ditch effort to survive. Ditching gear, bypassing their bailout tanks, and haphazardly deploying emergency air in a blind underwater scramble. But the cave had other plans. Whether it was a thick silt cloud blocking their vision or simply running out of air while lost in the confusing tunnels, Eagle's Nest stashed